Good afternoon. I'm your host, Brian Buckmire, here at the Law and Crime Report. We've got a number of stories for you. Let's begin with Harvey Weinstein. A woman has come forward accusing Harvey Weinstein of forcibly having oral sex with her at a nightclub at NYPD back in the mid-90s. Now, there are no formal charges, but the police are investigating this as a Class B felony. It's something very similar that the disgraced mogul is facing. He's now facing 23 years in jail because of a prior conviction. Similar charges are coming forward. Let's bring in our guests and let's talk more Harvey Weinstein. I'm joined with Dr. John Delatorre as well as Dina. Good afternoon to you both. Dina, let's start with you. These are similar allegations. The top charge of criminal sexual act of the first degree, a Class B felony, is something that Harvey Weinstein is accustomed to based on his last trial. What do you make of these new revelations?
Yeah, it's interesting that she came forward once the trial was over. It sounded to me like maybe something, she still wanted her voice to be heard. We know that he's been sentenced for 23 years. He has counts going in California. If he is convicted of this charge, he won't really be spending more time in jail. So, but the fact is that, she here, if she's a victim, she wants her day in court. She wants her alleged crime to be heard as well.
Yeah. Now, Doctor, it's pretty straightforward. You're looking at the statute here. The police simply need to show allegations that a sexual conduct occurred by some sort of forcible compulsion. I think the defense is going to be arguing here it's past the statute of limitation, but if they can put forward enough information and based on these allegations, it look like they may have that ability, statute of limitations might not apply here. What do you make of some of the arguments that may come up from a psychological standpoint that, hey, you waited this long, why didn't you come forward? There may be components of that in an upcoming case.
A lot of these survivors to come out and say, well, why did you take this long to say this? And why did you take this long to come forward? Or you only did it after he's already been convicted. Every individual has their own way of dealing with the trauma that they experienced. And it was probably for her that she finally had the courage, maybe through therapy or maybe through her own coping resources, to come out and finally tell her story. And I won't be surprised if there's more and more individuals that come out that trickle over time as we continue with this process with him.
Now, Dina, I'm going to ask you both questions, but we'll start with you, Dina. In the past, the argument of you didn't come forward fast enough, why didn't you do this? The so many whys that we see are par for the course when it comes to these sexual cases. It seemed like Harvey Weinstein's conviction flipped that on its head, that those excuses will no longer be, held as strongly as they were in the past in these types of cases. Do you think that we might see a similar path towards a conviction if these charges do come to a grand jury or maybe even a jury?
Well, we still have a lot to learn about this claim, and she did file it. And as time goes on, we'll hear a little bit more about the evidence. But, I think it's interesting to know that, like you said, this had no statute of limitations, which means that there was no time limit with which she had to file her claim. So the idea that she should be judged for filing her claim years later doesn't make any sense, right? Because the law has already built in an allowance for her to be able to file it anytime. They say this crime is so severe, you should be able to file it whenever you want. And any judgment of that is just society putting it on. But technically, and because of its severity, the law has allowed her to take as much time as she wants to come forward.
Yeah, and oftentimes I'm very critical of the law that it lags or it's a little behind of understanding how people report crimes, how people even commit crimes. And it seems like here the law, as you're saying perfectly, Dina, has afforded for victims to come forward with these allegations, and they understand it might not happen after a week, after a year, or even after 10 years, and that's why there's probably no statute of limitations. Let's switch gears, but still stay on Harvey Weinstein, because Weinstein also awaits trial in Los Angeles, where he faces 11 additional charges of rape and sexual assault involving 5 women. Now, Weinstein has previously requested to be released on $2 million bail pending his appeal, but it appears that he's almost given up on that potential of being released and is instead focusing on his appeal. Now, he's spoken to some reporters through his lawyers, and we're finding very curious language of him describing his appeal as being the Sistine Chapel of appeal and hoping that his lawyers are the Michelangelos to paint that picture. Doctor, as you're seeing this appeal, we're seeing charges in LA, we're seeing potential arguments coming up out of New York, out of a new complaining witness about new charges. How do you see these cards stacking up for Harvey Weinstein in all of this?
Right. So there are a lot of different dynamics that are happening with Harvey Weinstein. I think, as I've described it before, his behaviors towards these women has always been about coercion, power, and control. And so at first he was trying to get out on bail, and now that's not happening. Now he's switching gears. Now he's trying to make it seem like he's got everything in the bag, that he's going to be okay, that ultimately all of this stuff's just going to kind of go away. I think that's probably his own sort of defenses coming through, recognizing that perhaps things are going to be a lot more difficult for him, but he himself needs to put on a strong front.
Now, it appears that the same lawyers you're seeing there behind Harvey Weinstein are going to be taking up his appeal. Let's look back to March 11th when he was convicted in that press conference that his lawyers gave after that conviction in New York City.
What does this sentence represent for you? What does it represent for you?
Total unfairness and a complete lack of acknowledgement of what the facts and evidence of this case actually showed. I think the judge took things into consideration that never should have been taken into consideration, especially when we know in a prior case recently, the judge gave someone in a much worse circumstance 7.5 years.
So he said he felt remorse for the situation.
Anybody else?
Harvey
Harvey feels, it's a terrible, of course it's too harsh, it's ridiculous. Harvey feels terrible, of course he does. This is not an easy day. We hope that this sentence will speak to the appellate court in a way that will show that this has been unfair from the very beginning, and here's just one more thing that we can add to the list of things that did not show a fair, just, and impartial trial.
Does he think he's a victim? Does he think he's a victim?
What's the next step?
Well, yeah, sure. The appellate court will be able to review this once the appeal is filed. Obviously, that can't happen until now this portion of the case is done, and we'll go from there.
So, Dina, it appears that Donna Rotuno there, the lawyer on behalf of Harvey Weinstein, who will be taking up the appeal, as we understand, is talking a lot about the punishment of 23 years. I get it. You hear about the Los Angeles case, you hear about these new allegations in New York, but the Court of Appeals should be locked and focused only on that one case where he's convicted, which I think is going to be a difficult task in of itself. But when you look at just that case, do you think that the judge, as Donna is saying, went beyond what the judge should have done in terms of the 23 years?
Well, the judge himself said that he was taking into consideration that this, although may have been his first conviction, wasn't his first offense. And although he wasn't taking these prior claims, of which there were a ton of them, as proven in court, he was taking them into consideration. I just have to say that description of the Michelangelo, I don't think I've ever heard of a lawyer being described in such a positive light. Sometimes I think people put a little bit too much either reliance on their lawyers or blame on their lawyers. And the fact is, it's usually the facts that get somebody in and out. And we might talk about it a little bit, but I think their best appeal is probably the juror who wrote the book and the fact that she wasn't excused.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. So many moving pieces. Doctor, when you hear about these allegations, let's move the law out of here for a second. You're hearing allegations upon allegations, and there seems to be some consistency in these allegations of how this individual, being Harvey Weinstein, allegedly pushed these women and forced them into these sexual acts. What's the painting or the picture that you view of that individual as you hear these allegations?
Yeah, again, this is someone who never gets told no. And even with women with agency, when they try to tell him no, he's not going to accept that. And so all of these behaviors suggest the kind of person who's using their position for power and control. And yes, it's about sex, but it's also about dominating and making sure that he's always on top. So, I'm not surprised that all of these allegations about these behaviors are so consistent, because this is what he tries to do probably in his regular business day-to-day acts.
All right, we're going to take a quick break and come back with more here at the Law and Crime Report as we dive into more stories across the country.
We just completed Operation Autumn Hope, over 50 law enforcement agencies and social service providers in addition who conducted a human trafficking sting all across the state. Human trafficking only exists when there's supply and demand. So we're enforcing Ohio's laws about promoting prostitution, about solicitation, also against the Johns who provide the demand and the money to drive this illicit trade. But it wasn't just about arresting people. It was also about providing hope and providing help. Sometimes, oftentimes, the victims of human trafficking are eager to escape it. They don't know how. And so sometimes what they need is a listening ear, a safe place away from their trafficker, drug treatment to deal with the addiction that led them into captivity to begin with. That's why we provided more than just law enforcement. We also provided helpers, a helping hand, social workers, counselors, people that connect them with the social services and help they so desperately need.
So that was the Attorney General of Ohio, David Yost, talking about the success of Operation Autumn. Now, that is a great success. Just the numbers alone, we're talking 109 human trafficking victims, 179 arrests, 45 missing children rescued. You can see the numbers there on your screen. Incredible numbers. Each one of those an individual saved, each one of those a family that has reunited. Let's bring in our guests. Let's start off, Dina Dahl. Talk to us about this initiative and anything you might know about just human trafficking in general in the country.
Well, this is just so impressive. I mean, talk about a really well done, coordinated effort. It was both local officials, the FBI was involved, and like you said, not only police, but afterwards social services. I believe there was like a local university who studies this, who came to help also the victims. You know, it's massive, the number. That's what struck me. I mean, you're talking about a month-long investigation, not really that long, because they had a similar one in August that yielded so many missing children. And this is just in Ohio. And Ohio is not even on the top of the list in terms of the number of human trafficking. I mean, California and New York are largest in sheer numbers. Las Vegas is one of the top in terms of per capita. So when you think about that, how many people they found in a month, just imagine what really is going on across the country.
Now, Doctor, I feel like you can attack this as a psychologist from multiple angles, whether it be the women, because it is disproportionately women. I know men do get trafficked as well, but the women who are being trafficked, the Johns, and when I say Johns, those are the men who are paying for the service, and then also the people who are actually facilitating this. I often find that gets lost. It's often the trafficker and the traffickee that get caught up, but the people who are actually promulgating the system often evade prosecution, which is always a harm here. But talk to us about this from a psychological standpoint as to how we can best help those who are victims of trafficking, but also ensure that system in place doesn't continue.
Well, it's really about awareness. It's really about understanding that this happens all the time. The numbers that we're seeing are probably just a drop in the bucket of what is actually happening. And I think it's something similar to what happens to the survivors that we were talking about in the Harvey Weinstein case, is that we have to understand that this happens all of the time. And sometimes some people aren't willing to share what exactly it is that's going on. So medical doctors, social service workers, all of these people need to be trained in knowing what exactly it is that's going on, from domestic violence to other kinds of physical and sexual abuse that are happening to these people, to see the early warning signs to provide interventions.
Yeah. And I want to just piggyback off of that as well. The stigma that comes with being trafficked, I think, needs to be removed altogether. In the past, they were prosecuted as drug dealers or possessing small amounts of drugs, small amounts of violence toward the Johns who are purchasing them. I think once that stigma is removed and we start looking at those women as victims of trafficking, because this cuts across socioeconomic background, it cuts across race. Everyone always seems to think this won't be my daughter, this won't be my sister, this won't be my mother because I am X, Y, or Z. But then we find out who these victims are. And I think, especially for me practicing as a public defender in New York, when I have these clients, I realize they're not that different from my sister. They're not that different from my mother, but for one bad decision or being introduced to a person or being hopped up on these drugs or these pills or having their passport removed, that could be a family member of mine. And I think when we remove that stigma, we understand it's not just some women, but it could be any woman or any person. I think that's going to be a way of helping out. But again, just my 2 cents. We're going to switch gears here and we're going to talk about the San Bernardino shooting, but not so much in the individuals who did the shooting, but the man who supplied the shooters of the San Bernardino massacre with those guns, because he pled guilty and received 20 years in federal court. So we all know the story. Doctor, let's start with you. But when we really dive deep into this individual, Enrique Marquez, who was kind of a little less known compared to the San Bernardino shooters, this is a person who almost, you can say, orchestrated this all. He helped in the planning. He got the guns. He used a straw man loophole to purchase the guns. And in fact, he later went on and said, well, they used the guns that I purchased. I mean, tackle this however you want, doctor, as a doctor, as an observer, as whatever. But I think there's a lot that we can kind of bite our teeth into when we talk about the individual who helps promulgate such terrors in this country.
Yeah, taking it as a threat assessor and watching, I think this person was probably introduced and radicalized into the extremist views of the two shooters. And so the best way to kind of get the person into that kind of extremist values is to make it seem like it's their values, and it has been their values from the beginning. So I'm not surprised that he's looking at this, Enrique Marquez, that he's looking at this like, well, I was supposed to be a part of this. I was supposed to be doing this. They're doing this stuff without me. Because in his mind, he was probably part of this, the shooting all the way through the planning. But really, the shooters were just using him to get whatever it was that they needed. He was never really going to be a part of this. He was just a way to get what the shooters to get what they needed.
Yeah. Now, Dina, you compound the fact that he has some participation in the San Bernardino shooting, but they also found rifles and connections to other failed attempts, specifically one against the community college that Marquez attended, and as well as those who were a part of the San Bernardino shooting, and another in a busy freeway. So it seems like if it wasn't for failures on his part, this would have been a situation where not just the San Bernardino shooting occurred, but multiple others. And I bring that up to ask the question, 20 years. He didn't pull the trigger, but boy, did his actions cause the death of countless others, injuries of far more, and it could have been a far worse if his plans weren't thwarted. So in that context, 20 years, is that too little or too much?
Yeah, that's a great question. Sometimes the disparity in our sentencing does make you question that. You know, I think he could have had a maximum of 25 years, and he's already been in jail for the last 5 years. So that's possible why he only has 20. And, you know, he didn't actually conspire with this particular shooting. He had planned the prior to, like you said, the discussions and planning around the community and the freeway that never actually happened. In 2012, he already stopped talking to this couple, and this attack occurred in 2015. So he wasn't involved in the actual planning of the San Bernardino attack. Otherwise, I think he would have gotten a much bigger sentence. But the fact was, like you said, he supplied the weapon, and without the weapon, they couldn't have done the shooting. But because that was the only thing he did was supply the weapon, I don't think they were able to charge him with much more.
Yeah. Now, numbers in the San Bernardino, and you're completely correct, Dina. Numbers in the San Bernardino, 14 people killed, 22 wounded, and the judge denied Marquez's request for what would have been time served, because from the beginning in December of 2015, he was already incarcerated, never was released, and so they were asking for 5 years in jail, which would have in effect being time served, you get released. So the judge really came down a little bit heavier and said 20 years. So as you said, he's going to get the extra 15 years in jail. A lot of the 5 years he already got. Now, the prosecution found that they were in contact up to October 2015, and I believe the shooting was in December. So there's some there's some discrepancy in terms of how much contact he had. I know the prosecutors were pushing and pushing and pushing, of course, to get that number as high as possible. But 20 years is what they settled on. He took the plea, no trial, and that's how that saga ended. One more person behind bars for attempted conspiracy to do other attacks that never went through, but also his participation, however small, for the San Bernardino. Let's take a quick break. We're going to come back with more, talking about a former baseball star who committed homicide, allegedly, and see how that's going to play out for him. Right, more after this. Welcome back. So the trial began yesterday for the former Corona baseball player, Brandon Willie Martin, who's accused of killing his father, his uncle, and a third technician after he was released, what it appears to be prematurely, from a mental health institution. Now, based on where he was, the Baker's Act typically says when someone is committed, they're committed for almost 72 hours. But in fact, he was released after 48 hours, told not to return home, given a bus token, and returned home with a baseball bat with his own name on it, and took it to the 3 victims. Now he's being charged with homicide along with other charges. Let's begin with the prosecution's opening statement and how they set to prove this case.
You will find out that Ricky Anderson died of multiple blunt force injuries inflicted by the defendant, the force of a professional baseball player, wielding the instrument of his profession as an instrument of death. Barry Swanson, a man who truly was in the wrong place at the wrong time. You will find out that Barry worked for a subcontractor of ADT called Defender Security. And you'll find out from the records we have subpoenaed that that company was contacted on September the 16th, 2015, one day after Sandoval had taken the defendant to ETS, and one day before the murder. They had been contacted by the defendant's mother, Melanie Martin, and she had requested an installation of a security system. And he being Barry Swanson, was assigned that job order, and he turned up on the morning of September 17th to install the security system requested by Melanie Martin. At about 4:10, he made a phone call to home base ADT because he needed to upload the information and have the security system online. And as he's in the hallway making that phone call, you'll hear that phone call was recorded by ADT. You can hear the commotion in the background. You can hear a fight, a struggle. And then you'll hear that the call is terminated by ADT because there is no longer any response from Barry Swanson. And there was no response by Barry Swanson to the ADT call center because Barry Swanson had just been beaten to death by the defendant.
Now, Dina, it seems like the prosecution, at least when we talk about the 2 different parts of this case, the first one being the factual portion of the case, is he guilty or not? And the second being the sentencing phase as to what that penalty is going to look like. It seems like the first part, the prosecutors got it in the bag. All the evidence so far seems to be pretty strong. How do you think that first portion of the trial is going to go for either side, the defense or prosecution?
I think, like you said, it's definitely going to go for the prosecution. And the defense attorney in the media has been quoted as saying that he really is focusing on the penalty trial. So I think that they've realized the evidence is kind of overwhelming in the favor of a conviction.
Yeah, and now, Doctor, I know we're going to skip ahead a little bit because I think everyone, as Dina said, the defense attorney and even maybe to some degree the prosecution is kind of looking to that penalty phase, that second phase. We're talking about a former MLB player. Mr. Martin used to play for the Tampa Bay Rays. 10 years ago, we were talking about that $1 million signing bonus he had when he started with the Tampa Rays. But since that decade, he's gone through spending his money through alcohol and drugs, expensive realty properties. His life has really been turned upside down from what we knew of Mr. Martin back in 2011. And then the, of course, elephant in the room, 2 days prior to this gruesome killing, he's released from a mental health institution when the state says when you're supposed to go to this institution based on the Baker's Act, you're supposed to be there for 72 hours. I think the argument is obvious here. Something's wrong with him mentally and someone dropped the ball here. Do you think liability is going to be an issue for the prosecution when we talk about whether or not he was mentally healthy to commit these crimes?
Yeah, I'm surprised that the defense isn't putting forward a criminal responsibility evaluation. I think this is a missed opportunity to put a psychologist on the stand to talk to the trier of fact about what might have been going on and what exactly it is that led to the downfall and then ultimately the alleged murders of his family. So I think it's a missed opportunity for the defense.
Now, when we've seen athletes in the media, in the news, in this kind of fall from grace, is it different when you have, like psychologically speaking, is it different when you come from that background of making that much money, living that lifestyle, and you fall so far from grace as opposed to the average person who finds himself in that? Is the depth of the fall greater, I guess my question, or have a greater effect when you fall from that high to that low, or is it all the same?
I think it's all the same. It really just depends on how you view yourself and that fall, because sometimes it's the fall that matters. And so some individuals who maybe not have that much stardom, when they fall, it's completely devastating, while others with stardom, they make a fall and then they can easily return back to superstardom. We see that with actors and other athletes all the time. So it's really kind of up to the individual and how they view what's happening to them.
All right, let's take a listen to a little bit more of the prosecution's opening statement as they lay out how they intend to prosecute this case.
Eventually, he was handcuffed. He was arrested. You will hear that after his arrest, he gave a statement to Detective Gail Godfrey of the Corona Police Department. And in that statement, he says to Godfrey that he did arrive back at the home on Winthrop, but when he arrived back, saw 3 dead bodies. And Godfrey said, well, we happen to know that you actually had a conversation with your Uncle Ricky that day when you arrived back at the home. And the defendant then changed his story and said, oh yes, when I did get back, I did speak to my Uncle Ricky. He was alive. Then he said, I left the house and went to the front yard and was waiting for my mother to come home. And I was out there for an hour. And then when I went back into the house, there were now 3 dead bodies. And when he saw these dead bodies, this is what he told Godfrey. He said, he went through their pockets, took their cell phones. And when asked by Godfrey, well, why did you not call the police? Why didn't you call a family member? He said, under the circumstances, he didn't think it was a good idea. What you can see from the evidence and what you'll hear from the evidence is only one person had the opportunity to commit these killings, and that was the defendant. Only one person had the motive to commit these killings, and that was the defendant. Only one person had the means to do these killings, and that was Brandon Martin with his Louisville Slugger, professional baseball player. When you hear all the evidence, ladies and gentlemen, you will know the defendant is guilty. You will know that this black baseball bat, an instrument of his profession, was turned into an instrument of death. And it says it right there. Brandon Martin is the killer.
Now, the evidence is going to be played out here in this case, as it is with any other trials, witness testifying and certain evidence be brought in. But let's talk about the victims here. I know, Doctor, you were curious as to how this played out. We don't know all the facts as yet, but as I look at the facts that we do have so far, a 27-year-old former MLB player who attacked and is accused of killing Michael Martin, his father, who is 64, his uncle, Ricky Anderson, who's 58. And I mean, that's all unfortunate, but I think it's, when you look at that, Barry Swanson, a 62-year-old technician who was actually there at the time installing a security system to actually protect the Martins from Brandon Martin. He was also a victim in this case, and it's literally a wrong place, wrong time, because that technician had nothing to do with this. Does it make sense how this 27-year-old can overtake these three individuals based on their age and maybe where they may have been in the home?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's a professional baseball player, so he's skilled at knowing how to swing that bat. And he's used to swinging at, 90 mile an hour, 96 mile an hour fastballs. So if there's a stationary object like a human head, then he's absolutely probably going to swing full force. And depending on what his emotional state was, whether it was some kind of psychotic command hallucinations, or whether it was anger, resentment, whether it was jealousy or fears or whatever his emotional state was, probably had enough adrenaline going through him to just keep swinging and not really think about the consequences of his behavior at that time.
Now, Dina, we're talking about finding justice here, as we do with so many other cases. We obviously focusing on the criminal case, but as I read, a hospital releases an individual 48 hours, which I think is a little too soon, considering the Baker's Act says it's 72 hours, told not to go back to the home and is given a bus pass. And as the prosecution says, he goes straight there. I'm seeing there could be not only criminal charges here, but also civil charges, especially from the family of that technician against the hospital. Talk to us about a potential for civil charges coming up based on these facts.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. I could see a wrongful death lawsuit against the government for releasing him early, which makes a lot of sense because they expected him to be held for 72 hours. That's why the technician was there that day. It sounds like they didn't even notify the family that he was getting released early. If they had been able to notify him, even, they could have done something different. They might have left the home until they could secure it or something like that. So I think there's a lot of failings there. The fact is also, did they properly assess him that he was able to be released a day early? There should have been some sort of medical diagnosis. It was because he was considered to be safe. We know he was definitely in a bad mental state when he was released. So the reason for releasing him early doesn't make sense from a mental point of view. It's possible there's some allegation that it was because they needed to free up a bed. That will all come out. I think there will definitely be some sort of civil lawsuit around this.
All right, we're going to take a quick break and come back with more of the Martin trials. We're talking about the potential defenses that the defense raised in their opening statement. More after this. Welcome back. We're still following the case of former Tampa Bay Ray Brandon Martin, who's been charged with 3 counts of homicide along with other charges in relation to killing, or allegedly killing, his father, his uncle, and a technician who was at the home during the incident. Now let's look at the defense's opening statements and how they intend to prove this case.
We're going to see a picture emerge of Brandon Martin, a picture that shows that between 2011 and 2015, his mind was changing. He was decompensating. He was going through things that he could not control, that his family worked very hard to attempt to work with. And it came down to, on September 15, the family at wit's end called law enforcement, said, help us. Mr. Kearse said law enforcement gave them 2 options. They didn't like either of them, but of course the least serious of the 2, let's commit it, pursuant to Welfare and Institutions Code, Section 5150. And you'll hear that the law commands when somebody is committed for a 5150 hold, they are to be held for 72 hours. And as Mr. Kearse lay out to you, Brandon Martin was in the ETS for less than 48 hours. Mr. Kurse argued to you, and by the way, this is not the time for argument. Mr. Kurse argued to you that he was abandoned by his family, and no, that's not the case. You'll hear evidence about that. But there's no question that Mr. Brandon Martin was going through significant mental health issues that were attempted to address. But then, less than 48 hours later, he was cut loose, sent on the street. Here's a bus pass, but don't go home. Or else you go. This is not an opportunity for me to argue how you should interpret the evidence presented. I will have that opportunity at the end of this trial. But this is my opportunity to stress that you keep an open mind.
All right, so doctor, listening to the defense's opening statement, I'm not quite hearing the insanity or mental disease or defect argument that I think you and I would agree may be very beneficial here, but I am hearing him attack directly at the heart of the sentencing phase and talking about where the blame should be put and also his mental state when this occurred. Talk to us about, both from the standpoint of the defense attorney making these arguments, but also kind of placing the blame on the hospital. How much blame should we put in the hospital for releasing him? What are the protocols that should have been taken? And with the little bit of information we have, do you see any failure on their part so far?
Yes. So I used to work at a crisis stabilization unit, so I understand the pressure to have an open bed to take in someone. But usually someone is admitted to the hospital because they're a danger to themselves or they're a danger to others. Now, it sounds like he was a danger to others, primarily towards his family. So if he's sent on a 5150, right, then he should have been there for the 72 hours. And each one of those days, right, each of those 3 days, he should have been assessed by a psychologist or a psychiatrist to try to figure out if he's still a danger to himself or a danger to others. If he continued to be a danger to others, then he should have remained in the hospital even past those 72 hours. So now we're left with the Tarasoff Act in California, which gave psychologists and psychiatrists permission to break confidentiality in either a duty to warn or a duty to protect. Now, for the most part, the duty to warn in California has kind of been pushed to the side and everything's been focused on duty to protect. Here we have someone who has previously interacted in a negative way against his family. So he has a target, right? So we have, as a psychologist, a duty to protect. So the family should have been warned that he was going to be released, whether he was, 48 or the 72 hours. The family should have been warned, and he should have been kept inside the facility until they were for sure that he was no longer having those thoughts. And so for the defense, it sounds like he's kind of getting to mental state at the time he committed the offense, but doesn't seem willing to go the extra mile to actually get a criminal responsibility evaluation done. And once again, I think that's a detriment to Mr. Martin and his case. While, yes, maybe he doesn't get it, maybe he knew, but it could certainly come up with some mitigating factors that I think the defense is going to lean on in the penalty phase of the trial.
Now, Dina, you spoke during the break about how this all started, the initial incident that brought Brandon Martin to the hospital. Can you talk to us about that? And also, do you agree with the doctor that maybe there should be an insanity or mental disease or defect argument that could be played here? Because it seems to be kind of ripe for the picking.
Yeah, so it seemed like for at least a year after he was released from his contract, or even before he was released from his contract, there were multiple times that the police came out because of excessive parties, and he had lots of citations around that. But just prior to this, his family called 911 because he was beating his father. And when the police came, they were going to admit him to the hospital, and the family were reluctant at first because they didn't want that to mar any prospective baseball career he may have. But the police said the alternative was actually him just being charged with a crime. So they agreed to allow him to go to the hospital. I was struck by that because he had already fallen, as you said, so far, and had at this point had such a long history of, either the beating of his father, addiction issues, probably mental health issues. And so there was some denial all around, probably, him himself not wanting to accept the fact he was no longer this professional baseball player, but also the family as well. And you wonder if that was possibly why this person did not receive mental care earlier. He probably should have been in some sort of mental or rehab facility much earlier.
Exactly. Now, let's switch gears to our last topic. A Georgia teen apologizes for a plot to kill black churchgoers at a predominantly black church. Now, she's being sentenced to time in a juvenile detention center for about 5 years, and after that will face probation for 10 years. Now, in this apology, she had to do so based on part of the requirements for the plea deal. I want to bring in our doctor here because this one had me scratching my head just a little. Now, for me, I'll have apologies just as much as the next person, okay? Give them to me as much as you want. But when it's mandated by the plea, and when it's an apology, not for something like, hey, John, my bad, I punched you in the arm, or Dina, I'm sorry, I called you a bad name. My bad, I was angry that day, I didn't get my coffee. But this is a deep-seated belief. The prosecutors are accusing her of having a t-shirt that said, "Free Dylan Roof." I am a white supremacist, swastikas on them. She almost idolized him to the point that I'm not sure if this was a copycat, a love interest, or her own values. So when I take that into consideration, and I'm asking you as your professional advice here, should we be believing this apology, or is it just because she's forced to do so?
What I would say is that it's very interesting, number one, that this is a female that's planning a mass killing like this. Usually, as we see at the very beginning of our show, we saw during the San Bernardino, there's a female participating, but it's never usually the first one. So if we apply sort of ideas that for males as we do for the females, what I would say is she's probably sorry that she got caught. She's not sorry that she was having these thoughts or wanting to plan this thing. She's probably sorry that she got caught, that she didn't actually get to carry out this thing that she wanted to do. And yeah, it's probably forced upon her because of probation. And so there you go. She's just saying it because, she feels like she has to.
Yeah, and Dina, when you dive into the story, it's interesting. She actually scoped out the church and attempted to go on a certain day where she can get the most amount of parishioners there to increase the potential for death. Now, she was planning on doing this with knives. I don't know how many people she anticipated on killing with knives, but this was something that wasn't a spur of the moment. This seems to be very well thought out. When we think about that and you look at the sentence for a 17-year-old teenager, because that's what she is, how do you square the amount of time that she's going to be sentenced to and also the probation with her age? Is it appropriate? Is it too little? Is it too much? What are your thoughts?
It's probably appropriate and also based on, I'm sure, their evaluation of her. I mean, her apology evidently was very emotional, and it is possible that she does have some remorse, and maybe they have gathered that from their questioning of her and are okay with the fact that she's young and maybe is learning from this. The fact is not everybody would be willing to make an apology like this in open court. I mean, there are some people with these die-hard beliefs that would probably never say in open court they apologize for this kind of hateful, racist intent. So the fact that she did at least shows that there's maybe a window there. And I have to say, I heard the response from the church to her apology, and it was the most beautiful thing. And the fact that, one of the points was that they will not write her off, that she, in their eyes, kind of still has a chance. And I'm not quoting it correctly, but I hope she heard that. I hope she takes it to heart. I hope she takes these years to further get away from this act that she tried to take.
Exactly, and I think it was a very powerful thing that they said, and I think we'll end the show on that. John, I want to thank you for joining us, Dina as well. And let's end with that quote. While we are angered and frustrated by this incident, we do not hold hostility against this defendant. While she apparently hates or hated us, we do not hate her and do not wish to nullify her future and do not give up on her. I agree, Dina, it's a very beautiful message. She will be incarcerated for the next 4 years and probation for 10 years after that. The hope is that she changes when she comes out, and that apology is dear. Thank you again for both joining us. Make sure to stay tuned to our regularly scheduled program. I'll see you guys tomorrow, actually, the Law and Crime Report.